I've been collecting tools now for 50 years, ever since my dad got me started in woodworking as a teenager. I can still remember the first power tool that I bought at 15 years of age. It was a Craftsman corded half-inch chuck electric drill, and it was a monster. And it was powerful though, and it did very well. Matter of fact, that tool still works. I still have it. I'm not using it because I have a cordless drill that is much more convenient to use, but I still have that old drill. So really I'm talking about tools that have been very, very useful to me since I've bought them. So I'm quite sure that if you asked other woodworkers that have got as much experience as I do, their list would be totally different than mine. Okay, each of us go down our own path and each of us does things our own way. In woodworking, there's usually more than one way to do things, so it's not surprising that other people would have different ideas about what are the tools that they need the most. But these are the tools that I wish that I had bought sooner. The very first thing I've got to mention is a moisture meter. Now, I actually didn't buy a moisture meter until I got a lathe, and then I realized I needed it to go with my lathe. But once I got it, I started checking the moisture content of my lumber before I started using it, and realized I should have bought this years earlier. What a moisture meter does is tell us the moisture content of the wood. Now, as a new woodworker, I really didn't think that mattered. I just got the wood from the lumberyard and started using it. But as I've gone through the years of experience, I've learned just how important moisture is. I see a lot of new woodworkers posting pictures on Facebook or other social media of, say, an edge-glued tabletop and it's warped. And they're asking, how did that happen? Well, the answer is always the same. Their wood wasn't dry. And why wasn't it dry? Well, they didn't have a moisture meter. They brought the wood home from the lumberyard, cut it up, and glued it together, probably the same day, without even giving it time to acclimate. That's where a moisture meter comes in. By checking the wood's moisture, they would know when that wood is dry enough to do that glue up safely. And it also, in the process of drying, they'd find out, oh, gee, some of that wood already warped. And they'd straighten it out before gluing it together instead of having it causing problems afterwards. So what am I talking about here? Wood, freshly cut wood, usually has a moisture content around 25%. Now, some types of woods will have higher than that, okay? For using it, hardwood should have a moisture content of 6 to 8%, and softwoods should have a moisture content of 9 to 14%. If you're turning wood on the lathe, 9% is considered just about ideal, okay? The moisture meter has 4 different ranges on it, depending on the type of wood that allow us to check different types. Now, there are moisture meters with pointy probes like this one, and there are also moisture meters with non-penetrating points. They're just little pads. Those are actually better because they won't damage the surface of your wood. But you put it up against the wood, push the button, and it'll tell you what the moisture content is, which tells you in turn whether or not it's safe to do whatever it is that you want to do with that piece of wood. The next tool I want to mention is a random orbital sander. Now, I've had sanders. I've had sanders all through the years. But most of the sanders I've had are what we call palm sanders, you know, the quarter sheet vibratory sanders. I've known about palm sanders for, I don't know, 20, 30 years. I've thought about buying one for as long, and I never got around to doing it because I had the other ones. It's like, well, I've got this. Well, when I finally got around to buying a random orbital sander, I realized it's a much more efficient way of sanding. They'll remove material faster, and they're really good at avoiding putting scratch marks across the grain. I've only had this one for a couple of years, and I've used it considerably. Random orbital sanders are also much better at extracting the dust as opposed to just leaving the dust laying on your workbench. So I consider a random orbital sander a much better sander than a vibratory sander. Now, there's still times I use the vibratory sanders. I've got 3 of them. But I use this one random orbital sander more than I use those 3 together. One of the nice things I found with the random orbital sanders is they all have hook and loop fasteners, so you can change out your sanding medium, going from really, really coarse to really, really fine. And that doesn't mean you have to tear it off and throw it away. You can put that piece of sandpaper back on there. With my quarter sheet vibratory sanders, I'm using a self-adhesive sandpaper. I take it off and I've got to throw it away. I can't put it back on. That's why I've got 3 of them, because I've got 3 different grits of sandpaper on them. This one sander, though, does more than those 3 for me. So I would put this on my list because of the time it saves. It's a much more efficient way of sanding wood than using those vibratory sanders. The next thing I put on my list is a decent set of chisels. Now, I've had chisels all along. I've had chisels since day one. Well, maybe month one, not day one, but mostly they've been cheap chisels. You know, you just when your tool budget is low and you can't afford much, you buy cheap stuff, right? Well, last Christmas I put on my wish list this particular set of chisels, which was on sale at the time, and my wife bought them for me as one of my Christmas gifts. And these are decent quality chisels. Now, I wouldn't say these are the best out there. This is about a mid-range chisel, okay? Really what you're paying for when you buy something like this or any other edge tool, you're paying for the quality of the steel that goes into it, okay? These are a decent quality steel, which means they'll hold an edge longer, which is important. A cheap chisel will not hold an edge as long as a medium quality, and a medium quality won't hold an edge as long as a high quality. So that's what you're paying for, okay? Why is a set of chisels so important? You know, I always thought of chisels just as something when you need something to hog out a bunch of wood. You know, you gotta, like insetting, doing a mortise for insetting hinges, or doing the mortise necessary to put a lock set in. I never really thought about chisels and joinery until I started doing more complex hand-cut joinery, specifically finger joining and dovetail joining. You know, even you could really add to that lap joints, although, you know, to a large part lap joints are cut on the table saw, but then you got to finish up the cut with a chisel. And you see, when it really comes down to it, if you want a very accurate cut, you don't make that cut all the way with a saw. What you do is you make a cut with a saw that's maybe a 64th of an inch away from your line. And I don't care how good a saw you're using, you don't come all the way to the line with the saw. And then you edge up to the line with a chisel. That's the real value of good chisels. They allow you to make those fine-tuned adjustments on your joinery. And you can't do that unless you've got decent chisels to work with. So that's why I put a decent set of chisels on my list for tools I wish I'd bought sooner, because I always struggled with doing good, tight joinery because I was doing it the wrong way and I was doing it with the wrong tools. Drill countersink combinations. Now, you wouldn't think that that's a big deal buying those, but these drills are like 15 bucks a crack, as opposed to a normal drill bit, which is less than $1, okay? And I never bought them. Now, think about this, okay? In the old days, before we had multiple drills, what it took to drill a hole and put a screw in was 3 operations. First, you put the drill bit in and you drill the hole. Then you take that drill bit out and you put the countersink in and you countersink. Now, if you really want to do it right, you put then in another drill bit and you do your clearance hole. You know, get your clearance hole and your pilot hole, right? So the first board has the clearance hole and the second board has the pilot hole. Well, this has got a tapered bit, so it does them both at the same time. So then you've got your hole drilled, your 2 holes drilled, then you've got your countersink, and then you take that out and you put a Phillips bit in so you can drive your screw in. You waste a lot of time just changing bits over and over and over again. Well, okay, then that got better when I got a impact driver, because now I didn't have to make another change for the Phillips bit. Okay, we'll talk about the impact driver in a minute. But I was still having to change my drill bit over and over again. Well, that drill bit right there is essentially 3-in-1. It's my pilot hole, it's my clearance hole, and it's my countersink all in one. And by using those, and again, it's not a real expensive tool, I save myself all that time and all that aggravation of swapping bits back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Why didn't I buy that sooner? A few years back, I bought my first Japanese style saw, and you can see I've got 2 of them here. This one's actually made by DeWalt, and this one here is made by a Japanese company that I can't read, okay? That one's a dovetail saw. This is a general purpose, and one side is ripping and the other side's cross-cutting, okay? So it's pretty much a general purpose type of a saw. And for several years now, those have been my primary saws, and it's so much easier to cut with. Now, not everyone will agree with me on that. There are some people that prefer American-style saws. They've always used them. That's the way they're used to doing things. For me, it just never worked out right. These saws, I can make very clean, very accurate cuts every single time. So for me, owning Japanese saws has been a game changer. And I do pretty much all my hand cutting now with Japanese saws. Now, here's how extreme a difference it has been, okay? Before buying Japanese saws, I would go to great lengths to be able to try and make my cut with a table saw or radial arm saw, or even a scroll saw, to avoid having to make a hand cut, because I knew I wouldn't get that hand cut straight. That's how bad it was, okay? Nowadays, a lot of things, when there's not a lot of cutting to do, I find it faster and easier to use one of these hand saws to get the work done than to set up the table saw or the radial arm saw to make the cuts. That's the benefit, okay? So Japanese style saws, you bet. They're a high priority for me for saying, gee, I wish I'd bought that sooner. Maybe you've never heard of it. For years, I never heard of one. This is called a marking knife. You know, a typical blade, it's both sides coming into the point. A marking knife, one side is straight with the other side coming in. Why does that make a difference? Because this straight side goes up against your ruler or your T-square or your framing square or your tri-square, whatever you're trying to mark to. Why does that make a difference? Well, if you take a pencil and you try and draw a line beside any sort of a straight edge, your line is actually going to be offset a little bit. And that little bit is determined by how sharp your pencil is. If you're using a mechanical pencil, it'll be pretty close. If you're using a carpenter's pencil, it may be a 1/16 of an inch away. So it really can affect how accurate your cut ends up being. If you're trying to cut something accurately, and here again, we go back to cutting joints, okay? Yeah, you need to make an accurate line. That's what this is designed for. That will make the line right where the edge of that straight edge is, and I know it'll be exactly where it needs to be. Now, there are several different styles of these marking knives. This is just the one I own, okay? There's others that are of a longer flat blade. It almost looks like a kitchen knife, I'd say, except for it's a thinner blade, and it's flat on one side and angled on the other. There's different styles. They all do the same thing, and that is they allow you to mark exactly at the edge of where your straight edge is. That's what makes them valuable. You really don't need to use it for everything, though. You know, if I'm cutting some 1x4s up to make some storage here in my workshop, I don't bother with that. I use a pencil. I use a mechanical pencil for that. But when I want to do accurate marking, specifically for dovetail joints, okay, but also for other types of joints, the marking knife is the only way to go. Next thing I want to put on my list is a planer. Now, I have to say the planer is the only really expensive tool that's on my list, okay? I have a DeWalt planer. I think DeWalt makes the best planers for benchtop planers around. I don't have it on my bench because the thing weighs 95 pounds. I've got it sitting on a stand, and I never move it off of that stand. Getting it on there was bad enough, okay? So why is that such a big deal? Well, edge gluing boards is part of woodworking. As I have progressed in my woodworking walk, I've gone to larger and larger pieces. I've done more furniture, and especially tables of one sort or another. That means edge gluing those parts. Now, if I'm saying that, why am I not saying a jointer instead of a planer? Well, because I do my jointing on my table saw, and my table saw can cut clean enough that I can joint on it, okay? But the planer is necessary to get all those boards the same thickness. Now, before I had the planer, I literally would edge glue stuff together and then spend hours with a belt sander, handheld belt sander, trying to level them out. I remember doing some cutting boards and stuff that way, and it would take forever to level it out. With the planer, well, I can make sure it's level before I even put it together. So a planer is a big deal in the workshop. Now, ideally, yeah, buy a joiner and a planer both. But if you've got to pick between the two, I generally tell people, buy the planer first. You're going to find you're going to use it more. I use mine a lot more than I ever expected to. Now, again, it is a more expensive tool. It is one of the more expensive tools in my workshop. I think I paid about $600 for mine. Sometimes they go on sale for like $385 or something like that, but I think I was just shy of $600 when I bought mine. The only other tools I've got in this workshop that I paid more for, I paid a little more for my lathe, and my Craig adaptive cutting system was more expensive. Those are the only tools I've got. Oh, and the laser engraver, but that was given to me. Everything, so it's one of the most expensive tools I own, but it was worth the money. I'll have to say it was worth the money. Next tool I want to mention is an impact driver. Now, in my own defense, I'll have to say, when I started buying tools, impact drivers didn't exist. The impact driver didn't come out until I think about the mid-1980s, and as a cordless tool. Now, this is basically an electronic adaptation of the impact wrenches that mechanics use. Of course, theirs are air-driven. These are electric-driven and with rechargeable batteries, okay? What this does for me is that, two things actually, and they're both related. One of them is it helps cut down that thing of change the bit, drill the hole, change the bit, do the countersink, change the bit, run the screw in. At least for the screw in part, I can run the screw in with the impact driver. I don't need to change for that. That was a big game changer when I started doing it. It saved me a lot of time, even though I was still changing drill bits to go from drilling my hole to putting in the countersink. I was saving myself the time of having to put that third bit in so that I could go ahead and run the screw in, okay? Now there's something else it does for you though, is because it is an impact driver, it drives the screws in much easier. Now, it may not be a big deal when you're running short screws, say 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, but when you're running 3-inch screws in, 3.5-inch screws in, you need that impact action to get that screw all the way in. You're not going to do it with a regular cordless drill driver. Unless you just, you probably have to back it out and go in a few times and then put something on the screw threads as a lubricant. Yeah, you can get it in. I know, I've done it. But it's a lot easier to take that drill driver, that impact driver, and run it in one shot with that. It's also easier when it's time to take those long screws out. You can get that screw out without rounding out the screw head. So an impact driver is a big deal. I have a Ryobi. This is the only impact driver I've ever had. I've had it at least 20 years. It's held up very, very well. Does a great job for me. Are there better ones out there? Yes, I'm sure there are. There are better brands out there that are professional brands. This is a do-it-yourselfer brand. Ryobi is a great brand for the do-it-yourselfer. It's not really for the professional carpenter. If I was a professional carpenter, I wouldn't have a Ryobi. I'd probably have a DeWalt or a Milwaukee. But as a home woodworker, this has done everything I've ever asked of it, and it's done it very well. The next tool I want to mention is actually a tool accessory, and maybe you've never heard of it, and that's a router extension. This is a 1/2-inch router extension. I think you can get 1/4-inch ones too. And this is a collet extension, okay? What in the world is that for? Well, there's some operations you do with a router where you need to extend that bit out pretty far. A really good example is bowl carving. Now, this is a very shallow bowl. It's 5/8 of an inch or maybe 3/4 of an inch. And I can probably get the bit in here as deep as it needs to go while still well seated in the router. Okay, that's not a big deal. Well, what if I'm trying to do something where I'm doing a bowl carving in a piece of wood that's 1.5 inches thick? Now, I've done this, and I would not recommend it, okay? What I've done is I've taken that router bit and I've pulled it out a little bit so I could get a little deeper, and then I pull it out a little more, and that's dangerous. You can very easily hit a point where the collet is not fully grabbing that bit, and that bit, which is turning at about 30,000 RPM, goes flying off into the wherever. And that whatever might be right into your gut. Okay, it's dangerous. You should not do that. I shouldn't have done it. And at the time, I knew I shouldn't have done it, and I did it anyway. Okay, I don't always do what I should, all right? So what this does for me is I can chuck this into the router, and this gives me about 2 inches more of extension. So I can go and I can bowl carve, or anywhere else where I need that bit coming out farther, well past the shoe of the router. If this is sitting all the way in, I can have my bit all the way out. I could have it about 3 inches out, and I'm safe. And that's the beauty of it. It allows me to use the router for things that really didn't work out too well before or weren't real safe before. So that's why I recommend it. It's not a very expensive thing. Boy, I wish I'd found it sooner. But when I found it, I didn't waste any time buying it. The next two tools I'm going to talk about kind of go together, or at least the way I use them, they kind of go together. The first one is a digital height and depth gauge. Okay, actually it's more of a height gauge than a depth gauge. And this is used for setting the height of my table saw blade. For example, if I need to cut out a half lap joint, okay? I want to get that depth just right where I want it. And this allows me to straddle over the saw blade and set it exactly at the height I want it to be. I can also use it with the router when I'm mounted the router on a router table. Actually, I keep a router mounted in my router table and use it to set the height of those router bits. Again, when I'm trying to do a partially through cut. It's an inexpensive tool. It's plastic, but it's very accurate. Now you can actually do the same thing with a digital caliper, okay? It's just a whole lot easier to do it with this because this here straddles the blade or the bit, giving you a good surface. If you're trying to do it with a pair of digital calipers, it's not as easy, okay? You really kind of have to fudge it a little bit to make sure that you've got your height right, because it's right next to the blade and there's usually air there, and that just doesn't give you a good accurate setting. I highly recommend having a tool like this. Now, I don't know how long these have existed. I know that they didn't exist 20 years ago. Yeah, but with more and more tools going to digital and more measurement going digital, this has become not only something that's easy to find, but it's inexpensive as well. Now, the other tool that I said kind of goes hand in hand with that is another digital tool, another digital measuring gauge. This is an angle gauge or a protractor, or we could even call it a square, okay? It has a digital readout, reads in inches and millimeters as this does, and this allows me to set the angle of my table saw blade. That's the main thing I use it for, or to set my miter gauge for a specific angle. Now, we all know that if we take the miter gauge and we set it to 45 degrees, as it reads on the scale there, it's not going to be quite accurate enough. With this, I can compare that to the blade. I can put one leg of it against the blade and the other leg against my miter gauge's fence, and yeah, I know I got 45 degrees or 30 degrees or whatever it is I need. When I get done and I want to set back, I can set it for 90 degrees, and yeah, I've got 90 degrees. At the same time, I can also use it for setting the blade angle. Let's say I'm trying to make a box. You know, I'm doing a miter corner on the box, so I need to do 45 degrees. Great. So I'm actually not going this way. I'm going to 135 degrees, setting this on the table and this on the blade, and I know I've got exactly 135 degrees. Being able to set the table saw accurately is a key to good joinery when you're using the table saw as part of your joinery. That tool, which again is not really expensive, makes it possible. You know, the nice thing about this particular tool is that even if you buy the cheapest of the cheap, it's going to be accurate because your 0 point is with it closed. So you close it up, set it on your bench, turn it on, and it's going to read 0. So you're starting off, every time you use it, you're starting off with 0. Then you set it to whatever angle you want, and you know it's going to be that angle. Why? Because you started at 0. The next item I want to mention, it may seem like an oddball to you, and that's this right here. This is a set of transfer punches, and these are one of the simplest punches you can get. Machinists use these, and I knew about them, and I never bought any because I thought, oh, there's other ways I can do it. And there are other ways you can do it. You can use a drill bit. But this was an inexpensive purchase. I think it was $9.95 at Harbor Freight. And I've got maybe 36 different sizes going from a 1/16 of an inch up to a 1/2 inch. I've got basically every size. And what that allows me to do is if I want to get a hole exactly where it needs to be, say I've got a hole in one piece, whether it be a piece of hardware or a piece of wood, and I need to make a pilot hole in the next piece of wood, I just run that down, I go tap. Of course, I got to use the right size so it fits snugly in there, and I get a mark exactly on center that's just deep enough for my drill bit to go into to make sure my hole lines up exactly right. I don't know why I didn't buy these sooner. I remember these from my engineering days. The machinists had them. I used them. But I never thought of it as a woodworking tool until one day I ran across those and I said, you know, those would be really useful. And it turns out they're really useful. Low-cost tool. Again, it increases your accuracy. Just like these digital products, this increases your accuracy. As simple as it is, as we could say rustic a tool as this is, it does the same thing. It increases your accuracy. Talking about the punches made me think of something else, and that's these. These are automatic center punches. Now, I've had this one for years, and you've probably seen me use it, and this is a newer one, but they basically do the same thing. And that is, when you push down on them, they'll make an indentation into the wood. They're spring-loaded, and they'll snap down and make an indentation. Now, way back when I learned how to drill holes, I was told to use the center punch whenever you're doing it in metal. And in my engineering days, that's exactly what I did. But I never learned to use a center punch with wood. And so even though I had this automatic center punch for, geez, I don't know, 30 years or something like that, it was only about 10 years ago that I realized, oh, I can use a center punch with wood just like I can with metal. Why does that make a difference? Because it gives me a positive position for the drill bit to make sure I drill the hole where I want to. So while it wasn't a tool I didn't have, it was a tool I wasn't using that I should have been using, and I wish I'd been using it since day one. Using a center punch, especially an auto center punch like these are, to make that indentation makes it so much easier to get your holes right where you want them to be. And finally, the last tool I want to mention is the most recent acquisition in this collection, and I didn't even buy it. It was given to me by my daughter and son-in-law, and that's a right angle drill. I've looked at right angle drills for several years because I had one of those little attachments you put on your regular drill for doing right angle, and they're a pain to work with. What this does is allows me to get a drill into tight spaces. And when or for that matter, I can put a Phillips bit in it and use that in tight spaces. When I've got a need to get in someplace tight and put a hole in, put in a piece of hardware, take out a piece of hardware, that's what this is for. Do I use it all the time? No. But the first time I used it was the day after I got it. How's that for timing, huh? Maybe you don't think you need one. You know, it's something I looked at, like I said, for a few years, never got around to buying it. And boy, now that my daughter and my son-in-law gave this to me, I think it was for my birthday last year, I have found plenty of use for a right angle drill. So there's my list of tools that I wish I'd bought sooner. Are there other things that I could put on this list? Yeah, there probably are. I wish I'd replaced my table saw sooner, you know, things like that. I mean, but, you know, the lathe, well, I recently got into turning, and recently I mean, say, 5 years ago. Do I wish I'd bought a lathe sooner? Yeah, I would have liked to have one sooner. Did I need one? No. Okay, so there are things I could add to this list. But what I've given you here are things that are, by and large, low cost. I mean, there's only one really expensive tool here, and that was the planer. The rest of these are all under $100. Even this set, the set was right at $100. Okay, some of them are down under $20. The thing is that they've all been things that I have found to be highly useful since I got them. Will that guarantee that they're highly useful for you? Well, no. It really depends on what kind of woodworking you do. But I want to offer these as a possibility for you. You know, don't limit yourself to thinking in what you've always done or the way you've always known. There are lots of new tools out there. Some of them are gimmicks, some of them are a waste of time, and some of them are a big help. Find those. Find the ones that are a big help and make a decision as to whether or not you should add them to your tool collection.